You can even he's going to come out of his corner and I'm
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Great Decisions 2022. It's great to have people back in the room. The reason I'm using the microphone is more for the people following along online than you in the room, because I know I'm adequately loud enough to fill the room. So, before we get going, just a couple of quick announcements. As usual, I wanted to thank our great sponsors, without whom we would not be able to present Great Decisions year in, year out. And this is our 15th year of presenting Great Decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. So, a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a big hand for our sponsors, please. Also, if you're interested in the companion book, I cannot take it out of the plastic under penalty of severe repercussions from my manager. However, if you do not have one already, they are available at the service desk downstairs for $15 cash or check. So, before we get going tonight, I just wanted to let you know that we still will be having the question and answer period afterwards. Linda, who checked you in this evening, will be coming around with a microphone. If you have any questions or comments, please just raise your hand and Linda will get to you. I will be back at the computer throwing in questions from anyone who's following along online so that they can participate as well. As always, just remember, the only real rule is be respectful. Listen to what other people have to say. You might learn about someone else's point of view, but always be respectful. It's not always important that we agree on everything completely, but it is important to listen to each other. So be respectful and listen. Then, a couple of other programs that are coming up this week that may be of interest to you. On Thursday evening, it is a spectacle of grand proportions, a history of Ringling Brothers Circus. And Joe Colosso, the co-owner of the Ringling Mansion down in Baraboo, will be here with artifacts and 4 generations of stories to tell. Then on Saturday, we have this incredible free event coming up at the library called Flare in the Air, an aerial extravaganza with Cycropia. So you may be aware of Cycropia. They're an aerial dance troupe out of Madison, and they will be performing in the library free of charge this Saturday from 6 to 8. There will also be free samples of Pet Skull beer. Oh, I'm not about pandering. There will be free root beer samples from Courthouse Pub, and there will be some finger food samples from Mars Cafe. So, and also, Kaleidoscope Dance Troupe will be performing. So that is absolutely free of charge, no tickets, no reservations. Just show up on Saturday between 6 and 8. And that is it. So, without further ado, I will turn the evening over to Professor Pablo Toral.
Very much. I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the sponsors as well for inviting me. And I also want to thank you in the room and the people of Manitowoc. I come here at least twice a year normally here to talk to you, and in the summer to buy come. So those are my 2 annual pilgrimages to your beautiful community. It's really nice here. I really enjoy it. Today was a really pretty evening to drive up from Beloit, except for the 50 minutes I was stuck in traffic in Milwaukee. But I only have myself to blame for that because I had a lot of time, so I wanted to go to downtown, and then I saw downtown. Okay, but other than that, it was very, very nice. So I hope everybody is doing well. These days, it's kind of like, always the opening line. I think it's been a challenging couple of years. So at least for me personally at work, we've been teaching like this for a couple of years, not necessarily what I like, but it's been a requirement, and I understand why we do that. It's been incredible to see how young people, the students, have been in compliance with the rules, how they care about each other's health. So it's been a very challenging year, particularly for young people. I think we hear that suicide rates are very, very high, and I think it's important to make sure we are there for everyone. So I think one of the challenges for us in education is trying to make sure that the mental health of our students is there, and unfortunately it's not as good. Conditions are not ideal from a mental health perspective. So I hope everybody is doing well physically and mentally, and it seems like we're getting out of this, at least for now. So with that, I really want to dive into the topic of discussion today that you gave me. This is a topic that actually has come up maybe once or twice for like a minute or two at the end of one of my presentations that I presented earlier on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Drug policy is one of the more salient issues in U.S.-Latin American relations. So in that sense, there's been, it's not new to us, and I could sense that there was always one or two comments and questions on it, that there was certainly interest in the community on this. So when I was invited by the Great Decisions series to give a presentation on this, I said, okay, well, I think that there was probably, this one was probably just in the making. So I will open by telling you a little bit about myself. I teach international relations and environmental studies at Beloit College, just a friend of mine likes to say on the warm side of Wisconsin. And my regional expertise is on Latin America, political economy in particular. So those are more or less the areas in which I do research and I teach. And through my research, I actually know Monica Serrano, who is the person who actually wrote the chapter that you guys have in the brochure. Normally, when the Great Decisions people invite me to present, I normally read the chapter, make sure that I highlight the main points made in it. Sometimes I compliment it. But today I felt that I don't really have a whole lot to add to what Monica Serrano has to say. She's really the authority in this topic of U.S.-Latin American relations and the role of drug policy in particular. So if anybody knows about this topic, it's definitely her. So I think my presentation today is probably less original than normally. I hope you guys don't check out and leave. But what I'll do, I do added a few of my own things, is that I organized my presentation so as to highlight the main analysis that she's developing, and then add some data, because she makes a number of statements there for which she does not provide supporting data, in part because that's not the genre that she was asked to do. I mean, she's not really writing a traditional scientific paper, she's writing an essay, so that was excluded. So in a way, what I did is, is there data to support the argument that she's claiming? So I took some statistics and I plugged it in there. So for those of you who have read or are going to read her article, I mean, keep in mind that she really is the person who probably knows the most about this topic in the country. And she's at one of the elite institutions in Mexico. At Colegio de Mexico attracts some brightest minds in Mexico. It would be like an Ivy League school in the US, but she's had so many appointments in the US. I mean, she's taught at some of the leading universities here in the US. She's very, very cosmopolitan in a way. So a couple of things to make this to put things in context. US relations with Latin America are for the most part very friendly and very cordial. Most countries in the region, and the US in particular, share a sense of common identity, hemispheric identity. They share a belief that democracy is better than the alternative. The need for collective security, to take care of each other, to protect each other, to work cooperatively, to strengthen people's relations, economic relations, diplomatic relations. But there's three sticking points that normally make the news, in which relations are a little bit more difficult. And those 3 points are often when countries in Latin America elect politicians that the US government doesn't necessarily like. We've seen that in the case of Venezuela, we see that in Nicaragua, and this is compounded by the fact that in this case, Nicaragua and Venezuela, once elected, they don't want to go. Or Cuba, for example, in which case there was an election. So there is sometimes diplomatic tension, but with the majority of countries, they all agree that democracy is better than the alternative. Let's try to make it work as good as we can. Another area of contention is migration. Migration is a very politicized issue in the US and also in Latin America. So the US and Latin American countries don't always agree on what kind of migration policy is the right kind of policy. And three, drugs. And I will really dive into the discussion now. There was a point 50 years ago where the US and Latin America were exploring a similar approach to drugs. And in the last 10 to 15 years, they've been diverging. They've been going in different directions. So while the US has a preference for what is the right policy for drugs, countries across Latin America have actually moved in a different direction. And that has strained relationships and has created tension on that point as well. So that is, in a way, one of the main points that I want to emphasize today. In what ways were we all on the same page and now we're not anymore. So a couple of things to keep in mind is that part of the reason why drug policy has become so salient is because there has been a lot of crimes committed on the US-Mexico border in the last 15, 20 years, as Mexico has become the main entry point. And also because the US has been expecting that both source and transit countries, we normally call source countries those where the drugs are used, transit those where they are, how they get through to the US, and then the US being the destination country, the consumption country. So the US has been putting a lot of pressure on the transit countries and the source countries so as to help them adopt the drug policy the US wants them to adopt. And one of the principles of international law is the principle of national sovereignty. No country takes orders from anybody else. And the US has had problems on this one because it has been telling Latin American countries what they want, what the US wants its countries to do. And that has been a tension because if you have allies, you're normally likely to collaborate, but when you disagree on fundamentals, sometimes that causes tension. So what do? You really adopt a policy for which there is not a lot of support domestically to please your friend, or do you stand up to your friend and say, we can be friends on everything, but not on this one? And that has created tremendous friction because the US says, this is not one we can disagree on. And if you disagree with me, you'll be very sorry. So with that background—
Excuse me, Professor Toral, do you have your mic on?
I didn't.
Okay, because people online are having a hard time.
Okay, so is it working better now?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, definitely.
All right,
Thank you.
okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. So that was an incentive for those who came. Those online just missed the introduction, sorry. So that's okay. We're diving into the topic now. I apologize. I forgot to turn on the speaker. All right. So I was just saying that this has been one of the more salient topics in US-Latin America relations. Relations are cordial in general, with a few sticky points, and drug policy is one of them. So I will talk about what approach has been the dominant approach in the last 50 years, and why relations are actually strained on this, particularly in the last 10, 50 years. So the Monica Serrano's piece concentrates on the last 50 years of US Latin America drug policy, for the reason that the approach hasn't changed. It's been more or less the same since 1971. The guidelines, the goals, and the means were set in place. And the rationale, she talks about supply side, demand side. This is what we call a political economy approach. Think about drugs as an industry. So if we supply, so if there's demand, there's going to be supply. As long as demand is there, the supply is very unlikely to go away. So what happens when you actually engage in political pressure, military pressure to try to address the demand side or the supply side? And this is what she's addressing in the piece. So at the beginning of the policy in 1971, this was developed by the Nixon administration. On the supply side, right, this is the countries where the drugs are produced. The idea is if the drugs are not there, people will simply not use them. If there are drugs, you can't have any drugs, and the problem will go away. So that's one rationale to get supply countries to bring down production of drugs, and that really is the cornerstone of this approach. What are the advantages of this approach to the US? The advantage is you don't have to work with your youth to tell them drugs are bad. You just tell other countries, don't bring them here, our youth will not have access to drugs, problem is gone. So you basically, what you're doing is you're outsourcing the job to other countries, to the producing and the transit countries. It makes a lot of sense from a political perspective. If you can capitalize on the benefits of a policy, but you put the externalities onto others, it's a win-win for you, not so much for the others. So by outsourcing their job to Latin America, what you do is that the social, institutional, political, economic costs of the industry are borne by those countries that are given the job of eliminating the supply of drugs. The US gets the benefits, drug-free society. So on paper, it sounds like a win-win from the US perspective. But the Nixon administration knew that drugs were not going to go away immediately. So how do you deal with the people who are doing drugs in American society right now until the flow ends? By criminalizing drugs. There's a number of drugs that are legal, some that are not legal. You basically come up with a list. You basically put a number of drugs on a list of legal drugs, and you basically tell people if you use this, you're a criminal, therefore you go to jail. There's all kinds of penalties that come with it. And the penalties attached to drug use and trafficking were very, very strong, were very draconian. And the idea is if it really, really hurts people, they'll stop doing drugs. Again, that also makes sense, at least from a social science perspective. If something is very expensive, very hard, then people will do a little less of that. So when the US proposed this approach to countries across Latin America's perspective was, well, there is some good here, which is the US wants to collaborate with us. So that is positive. We should probably engage. And by collaborating on drugs, which few people would argue is a bad thing to do, who thinks drugs are good, other than some of my students probably. So we will strengthen the inter-American system. Okay. So, and if you really strengthen collaboration between the US and Latin America on drugs, there could be what in social science we call a spillover effect. If you and I can trust each other on fixing problem A, then we'll try to fix problem B, and then from that we'll fix problem C. So the idea is that if we get this right, then we'll address the other problem, and then the other problem, and then the other problem. The bad. The governments across Latin America are thinking, but really what they're asking us to do, they're asking us to do their hardest part of the job, which is, to deal with the source, to deal with the transit problem. So that really raised a number of questions in Latin America. And then the ugly, which became clear as it went along, is that the costs of the war on drugs were astronomical. And this is one of the arguments that Monica Serrano raises in her piece. The costs were so high socially, politically, economically, that led many people to say, for how long do we need to keep doing this? I mean, this is more than a test of our friendship with the US. There is really very little benefit to our societies in it. So I will elaborate more on that, and that would be the ugly part of the relationship. So once the basic goals and approaches were clear, what the US and countries across Latin America did is they put it on paper. We signed a treaty. So the framework was actually informed by a very general treaty that was developed in the early 20th century to address the opium epidemic, really, one that was particularly important to the British Empire, to China, but that offered the framework that the US really took in the 1960s and 1970s, in particular, to say, in essence, what this approach is saying is drugs are bad, We need to keep people from using them, and we have to basically attack them both at the source, but also at home. So what we need to do to achieve this is come up with a list of drugs that we agree we're not going to let through, and then have each society address the problem domestically. Whatever part of the problem that they have at home, it's their responsibility to do, but there is not to be any trade of these drugs across borders. So you fix your problem at home, you fix yours, I fix mine, but all together, make sure that you keep the drugs, where they are. If you cannot, put an end to the growth of these drugs. And the idea here is that drugs are coming from the outside, so which was the case in the 1960s, 70s that were the basis for this approach. So, back to the political economy approach that Monica Serrano is raising here. There were unexpected things that happened. So, if you think about trade and an industry, supply and demand cannot be very easily manipulated. And sometimes when you manipulate one, then the other behaves in very surprising ways. So, by rendering something illicit, unless you eliminate demand, you make it harder to get. So what you do is that the price skyrockets. And when the price goes through the roof, there is a lot of money to be made, which means that a few enterprising individuals will jump in and try to control that trade. So this is potential for money is there. So at the three levels, both at the production level, at the trade level, but also at the retail level in the demand countries. And that phenomenon, the fact that drugs became a very lucrative trade, made it pretty much impossible to fix. I mean, the problem hasn't really gone away because of a number of logics. It's what Monica Serrano calls the displacement effect. So there is a geographical displacement effect. For as long as demand is there, production will be there. If you attack production in Colombia, production will shift to Peru. And if you eradicate drugs in Peru, it will shift to Bolivia. And if you eradicate the drugs in Bolivia, production will shift back to Colombia, where you're no longer paying attention, or the Venezuelan jungle, or Suriname, where conditions are right. So we call these balloon effect as well. It's like a balloon. You put pressure on one side of the balloon, and it pops up in the other. So you concentrate your policy in Colombia, and then production shifts very, very quickly. It's very easy to do that. The second one is substance displacement. From an industry perspective, if it becomes really hard to procure the drugs that the market demands, then what you do, you give them something else. But you will only succeed in the trade if you move to a new drug that is more lucrative. And it will only be more lucrative if people are more willing to buy it because it has benefits that the other one didn't have. So what happens is that the substance displacement effect, what it causes is that success in eradicating one drug will cause the development of an alternative drug that is probably going to be stronger and more lucrative and potentially harder to eradicate. And these logics is what has made the war on drugs particularly hard to fight, because the industry, the private sector, normally works really, really well when given the right incentives. And those incentives are there. Demand is very, very high. So, for example, if we go back to the 1970s, in the 1970s, two of the major drugs that were coming into the US market were heroin that was being produced in Turkey. Turkey has been an ally of the US for most of the second part of the 20th century, strong trade relations, so pretty much all you need for trade to happen is there. And marijuana, in particular from Mexico, which is very close, just south of the border, so transportation in this case is very, very simple. So at the very beginning, the focus then was on eradicating the production of heroin in Turkey and the production of marijuana in Mexico. So as efforts were successful, what happened is that heroin production from Turkey moved to Mexico. Those who knew how to produce heroin in Turkey said we need to move on and bring our trade with us, so they moved to Mexico. And in Mexico, they found very willing workers willing to apply for jobs in this industry. Those growing marijuana took the trade to Colombia, where there were no efforts at the time to try to eradicate Colombia. So at that time in the 1970s, Mexico played a very important role, not only because it was the main source of marijuana to the US, but also because Mexican drug cartels control entry into the United States, and this is very important. So what happened is a lot of this heroin comes from Turkey to go to Mexico, and then from there into the US along with marijuana. But now the displacement effect kicks in. So if you look at these two graphs, so I don't think that people, yes, I think that people online can see those graphs. So what I did is I looked at a couple of graphs about the impact of the efforts to eradicate marijuana in Mexico and heroin in Turkey. And what you see is that the policy was successful. So we see that production of marijuana, and this is the table to the left, went down. And if you look at heroin, the one on the right, decreased from the 1970s on. So that is success. The policy did work, eradication worked. But here comes the displacement effect. So if it is hard to grow and trade marijuana and heroin, let's come up with something else, cocaine. So what you see is if the drop of those two drugs, then you have a new one, cocaine. The governments of Latin America and the US did not have the know-how or the infrastructure to address these new problems. So you see is the private sector is always a step or two ahead of the government. So you see a significant increase, and this is the displacement effect. There is also a geographic displacement effect. The efforts then were originally on Mexico and Turkey. So what you do is you move production into new countries. Bolivia was a willing country, had all the conditions that were needed to produce cocaine. Peru as well in the 1970s. In part because both countries had some guerrilla activity. And if the government and the armed forces are going to be the ones fighting against drug production and transit, what these drug cartels do is they hire private security. Guerrilla groups that will be coming there and they develop a partnership. So you are fighting the government, I am fighting the government. My business is lucrative, yours is ideological. I understand that you want to create a Marxist regime, but to realize the dream of Marx, you need money, and I have the monies, and the Americans will pay for it. How is that in terms of PR? So what happened is that drug cartels funded the left-wing guerrillas, so they would fight the armies so that the drugs could be grown safely. As Bolivia and Peru become important production places, Colombian cartels started to come into the picture. Colombia is closer to the US. Colombia already had important trade relations with the US. I mean, if you go try to get flowers anywhere today, they're probably coming from Colombia. So it's very easy to put these in the cargo section of a plane under the flowers. Who would suspect that? So the cartels of Medellin and Cali, particularly, they started to take advantage of all of these trade connections, and they started to direct trade from Peru and Bolivia to Colombia, from Colombia to the United States. And that started to drain the resources of the Mexican cartels, because then the money stayed in Colombia. Well, as we get into the 1980s, the Colombian cartel said, what if we don't just transport the drugs? What if we also grow them? So they started to find land, and they started to find willing peasants that would work in the production of the drugs in Colombia. So as they started growing the business in Colombia, so production in Peru and Bolivia falls down. Colombia also had a very active guerrilla movement. Several guerrillas that are willing to work as security to protect the trade. The Colombian cartels also developed their own security forces to fight the police and the army. And what the Colombians did to try to basically destroy the Mexican cartels was to reroute trade rather than through Mexico to the Caribbean. So trade then moved to Florida. You might remember Miami Vice. That's based on true story. They shift that the Colombian cartels operated by using Florida as the transit route into the US and the banks in Miami as the place to clean up their money. So as a result of that, the Mexican cartels lost power, they lost financial resources, and the Colombian cartels became very powerful. So at that point, the biggest problem that they had was not getting the drugs into the US. They already had the trade situation under control. It was the nuisance of the Colombian army and the police that were trying to get them to stop doing the drugs. So what you see, and this is a very important innovation of the Colombian cartels, is they started to try to capture, call this in the social science, capture the state. The state is supposed, is an institution that is supposed to serve the interest of the community. When the state serves one section of the community that controls those institutions, it's been captured by particular interest. And what the Colombian cartels did is they started to blackmail, assassinate politicians, fund the campaigns of politicians. So I'm investing in you, but if you get elected, you take care of me. And if you don't, you'll be sorry. So there's a lot of money that went into politics in Colombia in the 1960s, and the leading Colombian drug lord, Pablo Toral, even ran for office and got elected as a legislator in Colombia. So and once you control the state, you can basically tell the army, well, I mean, we're already going to win here, so let's just not cause a lot of trouble. So geographic displacement. So the Americans know that there has been a shift both in drugs, types of drugs, and the entry points plus the trading groups. So the U.S. started to exercise more control in Florida. The Coast Guard becomes more prominent along the Florida coast. They reached out to Cuba for help, and Cuba definitely was willing to help on that. Cuba was really terrified, but they thought that Cuba would start to do drugs. So this is an irony how the U.S. and Cuba, that couldn't be further apart ideologically, couldn't be any closer when it comes to fighting drugs. So, very, very fascinating story. So as the Americans really get the Caribbean under control, what happens is that there's an opening in Mexico. Nobody's watching Mexico anymore. So some of the Mexican cartels start to reorganize themselves and start to reroute some of those shipments from Colombia and the Caribbean through Mexico. And of course, the money they charge is significant, but because this is a very lucrative business, the money starts to pile up. The Colombian cartels have trouble getting the money into Miami, so the Mexican cartels become important. So as we get into the 1990s and the 2000s, we see the trade shifts to Mexico again. And the Mexican cartels rise, and they steal the business from the Colombian cartels, which in a way paved the way for the peace process in Colombia. So there is no drug money. The guerrillas have no money to realize their Marxist dream. There is nothing to fight for. Plus, the guerrillas were lost a lot of credibility with the people. If you try to create a Marxist society funded by drugs, I mean, that doesn't really give you a lot of credibility. So the 1980s, 1990s were very hard on the Colombian people in general, but also on the guerrillas. And what happens is that we're really now in a situation in which Mexico remains in control. The Mexican cartels remain in control of the transit points and the entry points into the U.S., which is the main market. But what we have seen in the last few years, if you watch the news, you see the caravan of immigrants trying to walk across Mexico. Those are coming from Honduras, Guatemala, which is an indication that the Mexican state is actually hitting some success. They're making conditions very hard for the drug cartels, so they're looking for new homes. Guatemala and Honduras, smaller states, very poor, very weak, with very few resources, so it's a lot easier to operate here, it's a lot cheaper to bribe a politician in those countries than it is in Mexico, it's easier to buy the police. So really Guatemala and Honduras right now are two of the main countries where the cartels are operating. Mexico definitely hasn't gone away, but many of the operations are really either going through those two or being directed from those two countries. If we knew all the answers, we'd probably be out there getting them. But if we know how to read the cues, we can see that they're really active in those two countries because conditions on the ground, violence is very serious. So we talked about supply, we talked about transit, let's talk about use. Let's talk about the demand side. So the demand side we mentioned is based on the principle of criminalization. If you basically criminalize those who use or trade drugs, and you threaten them with very stiff penalties, serious penalties, imprisonment, fines, etc., draconian sentences, they'll stop doing the drugs. Except that hasn't happened. That hasn't been the evidence. So the result of that is that the cartels have actually resorted to the process that I mentioned as state capture. To what extent can we really capture and control those institutions so that they stop enforcing the law? So we don't want them to enforce the law where it really hurts us. So what we get is the Mexican cartels have been very successful at capturing, or again, by capturing I mean symbolically, they don't run for office, but they know how to elect the right people in the municipalities that the trade goes through. So if they really control those local governments and tell them don't send us the police or else you'll be sorry, then that makes transit a lot easier through Mexico. But if you can really capture the governments of the border towns in Texas, where the drugs are coming through, then you also have an easier entry point because those are not going to enforce, their law on the American side either, and that's exactly what makes the trade very successful. You capture the authorities on one side, those on the other. They basically tell you when to go, where to go, how to do it, so that the trade remains in place. I also mentioned that at least in the late 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when the guerrilla groups were very active across Latin America, they played a very fundamental role. Shining Path in Peru, the FARC guerrillas in Colombia, they played a very important role keeping the state under control when the state could not be captured. If the state is not willing to cooperate, then you call in the guerrillas. But because of the very lucrative nature of the business, very often they had the technology and the means to really keep the trade going, to keep the state, which means that in a number of occasions, the governments of Mexico, the governments of Colombia basically told the American government, we just can't do it. We simply can't do it. They have better technology, they have more money, we exercise the best will that we can, but if they keep bribing our police forces, if they keep bribing our mayors, we can't do it. And they pay good wages. So in many parts of our countries, people are so poor that the only options is migrate to the US or to the city or work for the drug industry. So when given the choices, people would rather work from home rather than migrate to a different place. So it's very possible. It's very hard for us, if not impossible, to really put an end to this. So the US government started to pour billions of dollars, billions of our money into beefing up the state of Colombia in the 1990s and Mexico in the 2000s to try to keep them, to give them weapons, to give them money to give to the farmers so they would switch. And instead of growing, drugs, they would grow avocados, for example, like in Michoacan in Mexico. So Plan Colombia in 1996 was the first of its kind, was a very generous package of billions of dollars put together. Was crafted by the administration of Bill Clinton to try to get the government of Colombia weapons, American military support, with support with intelligence as well, to really strengthen the military so they could actually up the war against the trade. That in part actually helped defeat the cartels in Colombia, along with the fact that the Mexican cartels really undermined the power of the Mexican cartels. So when we try to evaluate the success of Plan Colombia, it's very hard to know how much of the credit should be given to the Colombian government that invested money wisely, to the American taxpayers that offered enough support, financial, logistics, military, or to the Mexican cartels that really drained the trade away from the Colombian cartels. But then the problem moved to Mexico. So in the 2000s, then the Mexican government, or the American government, we just don't have the resources to make this happen. So you better start giving us a few billion. And the Merida Initiative was a cooperation agreement that was signed in the city of Merida in Mexico. Was meant to do that, and it was making American monies available for a number of baskets that included support for building infrastructure to make the southern part of Mexico at the time a little more competitive, so there would be more jobs to support the military. And I really want to call your attention to the last point that I have on this slide, the capacity building, military capacity building. Because as we move into the 1990s and the 2000s, the American government really pushed countries across Latin America to use the military to address this problem. On the grounds that the military is less corrupt than the police is a local force. So if you really bribe the mayor, you bribe the police, and it's easy to do that. But the military is federal military. It's very hard to actually corrupt the government at the very top. In Bogota or in Mexico City. So the idea of beefing up the military was sold on two grounds. One, the military is, again, a force you can trust, and two, at this point, you really need to be strong. I mean, this is not a time to negotiate. You really need to send the troops out there and eradicate as much as we can and bring the cartels and the guerrillas to the point that they have to surrender. One of the sticking points with Colombia in the 1990s was that the Clinton administration said we don't want to be stuck in domestic problems in Colombia, in political problems in Colombia. So the Colombian government was telling the US, we need money for the military, for this and that, but we also need the money to use to fight the guerrillas. And the Clinton administration said that is a Colombian problem. It's not an American problem. We can't give you money to fight the guerrillas. We just want you to fight the drug industry. And the Colombian government said, but I mean, what is it that you're not getting? We can't fight the drugs if we can fight the guerrillas that are protecting the drugs. So that was a back and forth that lasted years. And the Clinton administration was not very popular in Colombia because they came up with a plan. It was called Plan for Certification. The American government, the Clinton administration decided that they could certify or decertify any country that failed to meet American foreign policy interests. And if they failed to meet those interests, they would not allow them to export goods into the US. So that was a way to put pressure on Colombia. Every single year, the American government published a list of governments that were certified or decertified, and this was a huge issue of contention between Colombia. To the point that Colombia told the Clinton administration, if you do not give us money for the guerrillas, we will not make any progress. You can certify us if you want, or you can decertify us if you want, but if you do not allow us to fight the guerrillas, there is no way the military will be able to beat the drug cartels. And eventually they said, okay, so under our watch, we want to make sure that you don't use the money to fight for your domestic interests. The money is there to further American national interests, and drugs is the way to go. After Clinton stepped down, things basically changed. George W. Bush was very clear about this. Tell us how much money you want. We just want you to put an end to the drugs. We don't care about how you use the money. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was a lot easier for the Colombian government to work with George W. Bush than it was to work with Bill Clinton, in part also because of 9/11. He could relate to terrorism. Basically, the Colombians were saying, who knows if these Colombian guerrillas are not harboring, Al-Qaeda troops there. So you have to give us the green light to get after them. And that was the green light. Same thing in Mexico. So since then, the American government has been a little less picky about how the money gets spent, whether guerrilla counterinsurgency or the drug itself, because of the intertwined nature of these two. So it's very hard to tease out, who you are dealing with at one point. And definitely, it's clear that if the drug cartels are paying the guerrillas to fight the army so that they can continue to grow the drugs, it's it was very hard. I don't understand how the Clinton administration kept wondering if they could separate one from the other. Back to criminalization. So what are some of the consequences of the criminalization of drugs? So one of them, what we see is that after the criminalization, we see that the population in federal prisons in the U.S. and also in state prisons, let's take this one for clarity, increased tremendously. Sociologists and criminal justice experts tell us that the biggest chapter that increased has to do with drugs. The penalties that were set for the use or sale of drugs. We see that things start to change a little bit in around 2010. Around 2010, I want to call your attention to one point here. I will come back to this at the end. We see that the number of population in jail peaks, I think around 2010, that's the Obama years. Most of that change has to do less with federal policy than it does have to do with state policy. Some states, such as California, New York, normally lead the country a couple of decades before everybody follows. And what they did is they started to ask law enforcement not to enforce too much, to be a little bit easier on people who were caught with small amounts of drugs, petty drug dealers, and go for the big guys. That also, obviously, if you're not going to enforce the law, you're probably not going to get so many people going to jail. Another argument in conservative states is that we promise people to keep taxes low, but one of the biggest areas. So where are you going to cut expenditures? If you really want to lower taxes, you have to cut public services somewhere. And a number of conservative governors said, prison, if you actually let people out of prison, then we can actually spend less money in law enforcement. So for two different reasons, the liberal states, they decided that the social cost to the victims of drug use would be made much worse by having them serve long sentences in jails or prisons. So to bring them out, we need to be a little more lenient in this approach. And in the conservative states, if you really want to lower taxes, we can't lock up so many people, because then you have to give them food, then you have to hire people, then you have to build places to house them. So that really accounts for the drop that continues today. How does the U.S. compare to the rest of the world? So the U.S. has a reputation in the world for locking up more people than most countries out there. So here is a combination of a comparison, a table for comparison. This comes from the Sentencing Project. It's an independent organization that has collected a lot of data on statistics on this topic that we're studying, and is trying to catalyze thinking about alternatives. So what we see here is that the U.S. really is up there, and a significant, the main reason probably, according to criminal justice experts for this, has to do with the war on drugs and the criminalization of the use of drugs. So in comparison, look at some countries, for example, El Salvador. El Salvador went through decades of period of civil war. There's lots of weapons left on the streets, so it's up there. It makes sense. Rwanda went through genocide 2 decades ago. Brazil, another place that has serious drug problems. Brazil is a net importer of drugs. Consumption of drugs is very high in Brazil, so there's also Brazilians have taken the same approach as the U.S. criminalizing drugs. Russia, well, as we know, if you follow the news, getting you to jail in Russia, you don't have to do drugs necessarily. You can just criticize the president. You'll end up there. But look at China. If you think about China, China is a country that also has a reputation for locking lots of people up. It doesn't really do too poorly compared to the U.S. This is another graph. So there's lots of countries out there, and I don't expect you to read their names, but that really puts things in perspective. And I want to call your attention to the two color lines here. One is the US, the other one is Germany. Because Germany is starting to wonder whether the approach to drugs and drug use is the right one. And they're asking questions, and they're looking for models. So one of one of the priorities of the administration of Angela Merkel was to really try something new to see what happens. So Germany the Germans have been asking themselves this question, and they basically look at the statistics and they say, well, that definitely this is not what we want in the US. By the way, number 2 here, oh, sorry, I was going to move away. The number 2 next to the US is Cuba. And Cuba also locks people up if they do drugs, but the main reason why you get locked up in Cuba is not drug use. I think you know what that might be. So, more data. So how has the population of Americans living in prisons and jail increased due to drug offenses? What we see, and this is the point I was making earlier, is the data to confirm that, is that the swelling numbers of people who are being locked up has to do with drug-related offenses. So that's what the data is showing. We see where things were in 1980, we see where things are today. The number of people serving life sentences has also increased significantly, and many of those life sentences have to do with drugs, some kind of drug-related crime. We see that the increase is also significant. So the graph that I have here is one that shows that not everybody has an equal chance of going to jail. The statistics of who goes to jail suggest that those of us who are men have a higher chance of going to jail than women. White men do better than Latinx and black men. So if you think about this, if you're black in this country, 1 out of 3 will be locked up at some point in their lives. If you're white, think about 17 of your friends, 1 of them should go to jail at some point in their lives. If you're Latinx, 1 in 6. If you are a woman, well, things are not as bad as they are for men. So this is one of the, so technically speaking, we know from statistics that the likelihood of committing a crime is equal, regardless of race, regardless of background in general. So the fact that we see clear inequalities when it comes to race suggests that there is a process through which members of some races are actually suffering this pandemic more than others. That's again one of the arguments by the criminal justice people. Along with all of this, there's been a booming business for the corrections industry. So again, the political economy approach tells us that when an industry has lots of resources, it's likely to use those resources to elect the right leaders that will pass the right laws. So it's very difficult to make changes when you've got an industry that is squeezing the wheels to further their own interests. So I'm gonna so for those of you who are watching from home, I'm gonna briefly go to these websites called the Sentencing Project. It's where I took the data that I showed earlier. And if I click on it, it should direct us there. I don't know that you will be able to see it. It's loading here. So I won't be spending a lot of time on it. But if you go here, you can use all kinds of data to see things that are very, very telling. So for example, this graph that I have here is the rate of imprisonment. It really varies from state to state. We see that the rates are higher in the south and west. So if you look at the map of the US, the further to the south and the west, the more likely you are to go to jail. If you click, for example, on Wisconsin, what happens if I go to Wisconsin? For example, I mentioned, let's see, black-white disparity. So what we see is that if you're black, the worst state to be in is Wisconsin. So your chances of going to jail in Wisconsin are the highest in the country. So there you do better than the US. And this is particularly the case in Milwaukee. If you are Hispanic, your chances are worse in the Northeast. So don't go to Massachusetts. Not sure why that is the case. What states are more likely to lock up their young people? So the Midwest, for some reason we like to put them in jail. See that the Dakotas are there as well, Montana. So I really encourage you to, if you're interested in these topics, you're going to see what the statistics are saying. So I really recommend that you go there. So, okay, so I think I'm not know how to go back to my slideshow, but I'm not user. Really working it out now. Which one of this is for the slideshow? Need to go back. How do I go back here?
I have no idea.
Oh, you have no idea. So, this is a tie. Okay.
Is there a PowerPoint bar on the bottom?
That's what I'm looking at. I don't see it. Maybe there is. I don't recognize the icon. Is any of you a Mac user? Can help us here?
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for the slideshow again.
On the Finder, possibly?
Oh, there you go. How did you do that?
I am not allowed to tell you. Because I don't know.
Yeah, it's probably digital technology. The fingertips. Okay. So let's turn to Latin America and try to see some data on the impact of the war on drugs. What we see is that the number of homicides in Mexico has really increased as a result of the drug trade. We see that there was a downward trend in the 2000s, but then we can see that things start to inch up a little. There's a little low point in the teens, but then things go up again. So definitely there is a significant impact on murders. So Colombia and Mexico, I mentioned, are probably the two countries that have been at the heart of the war on drugs since the 1980s. And the death toll is very hard to estimate, so we can really quantify what is the impact of the war on drugs by the number of bodies. Again, not very often the bodies are never found. So what we have an independent organization that has been trying to document. They estimate that about 300,000 people have died as a result of the drug industry in Mexico. If you think about that, that's probably 10 times the population of Manitoba. About 75,000 people have disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. Legally speaking, they're not dead, but nobody knows where they are. They're presumed to have been made missing through the drug trade. Colombia, what do things look like in Colombia? So very similar. The numbers for Colombia are a little bit more difficult to tease out because a lot of these numbers probably have to do with victims of the guerrilla conflict, not necessarily of the drug conflict. But the numbers are also very, very, very sad. I mean, we talk about more than a quarter million people in the last 15 years or so. About 80,000 are missing. Nobody knows where they are. This has been documented by a government organization called Centro Nacional. It's the National Center for Historical Memory. It tries to document the number of people that as a result of this. But also because of the drug industry, 7.7, almost 8 million Colombians have actually had to flee their homes. They've moved to, most of them are internally displaced or living somewhere else in Colombia. Some others went to other countries. That's more than the population of Wisconsin. So that is the nature of this conflict. That's the data from the United Nations Commission for Refugees. Colombia has the largest number of internally displaced people, IDPs, more than Syria, which is coming to the end of the civil war. So the conflict in Colombia has produced more internally displaced people. And one of the problems with Colombia is that those people, many of them are farmers, peasants, and they can't go home because the land was confiscated by one of the guerrillas and eventually sold to a large corporation or to somebody else who now has a title to the land. And that is creating a big political problem because they pay for it, they claim that they bought it legally, that nobody told them that the land had been confiscated or taken from others, and this is a problem that will probably never get solved. So the government is trying to give some of the displaced a piece of land somewhere in Colombia, but it's not enough farming land for everybody. So this problem, I think, is never going to get solved. So and here I have a few arrows that basically point to a chain of events, one which leads to the next, which leads to the next. So the approach taken to the war on drugs has transferred power to the military from civilian authorities. So as the expectation here was that only the military could solve the problem, more resources, financial, technological, were devoted to the military as opposed to civilian authorities. The result of that is that by mounting a military offensive, what happens is that the state was physically, literally trying to eliminate the criminals which fought back. And what you get is a civil war-like situation, one in which many people got caught in the middle. So at that point, the state becomes the enemy, and it's an open war as far as the guerrillas go. The result of that is an ongoing process of escalation. You can only win this if you can actually, get stronger than your opponent. So the drug cartels started to buy better technology, very often with the support of Russia, which was always a very willing seller. And the U.S. as well. A lot of the guns used by the drug cartels were coming from the U.S. And this is one of the ironies. The U.S. was arming both the cartels and the armed forces. So in the end, what happens is that when there is somewhat of a tie or stalemate, what the guerrillas did, what the drug cartels did, they started to try to penetrate the state, to try to control it, which means that the population lost faith in the state. There was no incentive to go vote if you're really electing the drug dealers. So they're not there to serve us, to serve the community. They're there to serve themselves. And the result of that is a loss of faith in the state and the institutions of the state, which basically leads to further militarization of the country. So people are losing faith in the politicians, they're losing faith in the state. There's only faith in the military, so let's give them more money, more weapons, more soldiers, and then the conflict just keeps spiraling out of control. And what you get then is that 8 million people in Colombia decided to leave home before getting caught in the crossfire. So this is an escalation that didn't seem to see an end. And the result is a very costly record for Latin America. Social, we talked about death, displacement within the country, the neighboring countries, and also to the United States. Economic too. If many farmers decide that it's more lucrative to grow drugs than corn, they switch. But when the trade, because of the balloon effect, shifts to another country, then what are they going to do next season? They don't have grain. They don't have anything. It's very hard to switch if you don't, if you're not ready for it. So this also made it very hard for the farmers to make a living. Many of them ended up moving to the cities. Plus, the people who actually decided to give in and work for the drug cartels, they could never legalize their jobs. They couldn't pay taxes. So they were always in the informal economy. So if you don't pay taxes, then your benefits are going to be lower. You don't get access to healthcare because you don't pay taxes. When you retire, what fund are you using? So that created lots of problems. It keeps you captive in that industry. And another problem is, I mentioned the militarization of life. Countries across Latin America proclaim to be Western liberal democracies where the rule of law should be enforced above everything else, and communities should engage peacefully and democratically. But because the state doesn't seem to be doing that, there's a loss of faith in the institution, and there's a penetration of military life all over political and social life. And the result is that democracy is a loser here. There is there's a loss of faith in the state, there's a loss of faith in democracy. That creates the right background for populist and autocratic leaders to run for office and get elected. So I'm tough, I'm not corrupt, you get me elected, I'll get it done, so I'll make them be sorry. And once they get elected, they further erode the democratic institutions because the status their friends. They started driving the media. So there's a process that has been, unfortunately, for the quality of democracy in Latin America, developing for the last 2 decades. That has made the support for democracy in Latin America plummet to lows, really low points right now, as the lowest it's been since the 1990s. Is there a way out? And with this, I really move to conclusions. Well, according to leaders of Colombia, Guatemala, and Mexico, not a surprise, there has to be a way out. The toll is very high, and we need to move on. So in the early teens, they asked the United Nations to facilitate and to open a conversation about a new process to deal with drugs that goes beyond criminalization and the war on drugs. Some countries have already moved in this direction. So I really want to end with some of the data from these countries to kind of illustrate one of the arguments that is put out there, but there's no data offered for it. So there's a number of countries that have already moved in this direction, some of them 2 decades ago. So we do have a number of countries who decided to deviate from this approach. And we'll call your attention to 2 of them. So how is this approach different? So the idea here is that by criminalizing the use of drugs, called this a punitive approach, we're actually putting a lot of taxpayer money behind law enforcement as opposed to education, prevention, and treatment. So the idea here, what if you switch that? Ask law enforcement to enforce all the laws, and the money that is paid for enforcing whatever drug policy was in place, you focus on harm reduction, prevention, education, and treatment. So again, countries have been doing that for a number of years. I mentioned Germany. This is a funny caricature by a German newspaper, Die Spiegel. That was prompted by the Angela Merkel idea. Maybe we should look at other examples in other countries. And the Dutch, their neighbors to the west, came to the front here. So here we have, it's a Dutch peasant, growing tulips. You can see the tulips at the back. Cheese, and we see that the cheese is stuffed with drugs. So that is one of the questions. So will the farmers now start growing drugs? And you can see that the fear of militarization. They are farmers with guns. How terrible is that? Okay. So in this graph, I want to call your attention to a couple of countries. So the Netherlands is somewhere in the middle there. It's a country that did not quite legalize drugs, but has told law enforcement to stop enforcing drug laws. That's is closer to the truth. So we see the number of people who died of drug-induced deaths in the US. We're talking here about 185 per million. In a country like the Netherlands, where drugs are more readily available, because the use of drugs is not persecuted, you can see that the number of deaths is lower. But I want to call your attention to the very top. One of the lowest of all is Portugal. Portugal is the country that actually moved in this direction earlier, about almost 25 years ago. So what I did is I decided to look at the data from Portugal to see what happened in Portugal after they decided to move away from the punitive approach. So, one slide in the Netherlands. So what we see here is one of the arguments is that if you legalize drugs, people who use drugs will commit crimes to get money to buy drugs. So this graph actually does not suggest that. So what we see here is that since drugs have been more readily available in the Netherlands, victimization rates have actually decreased. So there is no data to support that, it seems. What about Portugal? What happens to the number of people dying from drug-related deaths? We see that they remain way lower than the average of the European Union. One of the lowest in the EU, which is way lower than in the US. So the EU does better on this front. Portugal does way better than the Europeans in general. So another argument is, well, if you have people access to drugs, not only will they try them, they'll get hooked up and they'll continue to do them. So what we see here is actually the opposite. we see that recidivism, the use of the continuation, rates of continuation of drug use are actually falling in Portugal. A really interesting impact of this policy is the number of cases of HIV/AIDS diagnosed as a result of people who use drugs, mostly from injecting, has fallen precipitously. People don't need to share their equipment anymore. And this further supports that. We can see that the number has fallen from over 500 to just over 10. So that's a significant drop. So the same question on the Netherlands, so more drugs, access to drugs means crime. So what we see in Portugal, we also see falling trends. So the bottom, there's three categories here. The bottom one is homicides. The middle one, car accidents. It seems like it's the most interesting part to Portugal is driving a car. And the very, very thin one at the top is involuntary manslaughter. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the legalization of drugs and crimes. What about the US? So what do we see in the US? So what we see in the US is trends in the opposite direction. What we see is that drug-related deaths in the US have continued to grow more or less steadily. And back to the earlier point. So here's where the US is in terms of deaths. Portugal at the very top is the country that has had the longest experience with drug legalization. And I want to end by asking this question, is it coming here? Is the US adopting the Portuguese approach? This is a book that basically toys with that idea. And the argument is, yes, it is. But not at the federal level, it's at the state level. So what we're gonna see is how some states are gradually going to adopt a harm reduction approach, and then some others, when they see the results, they will try to learn from mistakes and adopt what works and avoid what doesn't. So it's not my argument, it's the argument. I cannot predict the future. Some people can, certainly cannot. So I would really like to end with a couple of questions that Monica Serrano is asking at the end of the book, and we can talk about those for a few minutes or not. Her argument, her question is, should the punitive approach continue to be used given the results? Should the US continue to dictate to other countries that they should follow the same approach, using its power and clout in international relations, particularly to its Latin American neighbors? A third question that she is asking is, how can we evaluate from an ethical perspective the fact that the drug trade has actually given some of the poorest people in Latin America a lifeline? It's given them a job, a steady job, some money, probably not a lot of it, but some money to put on the table and put the kids through school. So that really raises all kinds of ethical questions that she doesn't really answer. And the last question is, think about the cost of this approach in terms of human rights. So is it worth? So if you think about the number of people who died of drug-related deaths, really talking, let me go back here, about 185 per million. Is it worth the 300,000 that have died in Mexico from forest alcohol, the 300,000 that have died in Colombia, the 7 million people who have to flee their homes? So that's a very difficult question as well. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you. I don't know that I have the answer to those questions, but I think she raised a really good one. So thank you very much for your patience. And this is a very difficult issue, can be addressed at a number of levels, ethical, political, economic. I teach political economy, so I really took the political economy approach, which is what I do, not others that I'm not familiar with. So I'll turn it over to you. I don't know who takes it from here.
So if anyone has any questions in the room, Linda will go to anyone who raises their hands with anyone who has questions or comments. And I will be monitoring online to see if there are any more questions. There were a couple of questions that came up online, Professor Toral, but you answered them almost as they were asking them during your presentation. So as of right now, we are just looking for questions and comments in the room.
Okay.
Yes, getting a little sarcastic, would you consider pharmaceutical companies cartels? Considering with the opioid,
Yeah,
that didn't come out of Latin, they didn't come from Latin America, those are right here.
I didn't look at the methodology to see how they selected the data, so I don't think I can give you the answer to that question.
But that's a big factor, and that's just cold-blooded greed.
Any other questions? You talk about decriminalization of drugs. What drugs specifically are you talking about? All drugs or marijuana or, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that question is an open, I mean, let me give you an open-ended answer. So if we look at the displacement effect, is any drugs that are dominant in the market today and those to come. Because we don't know what other drugs will come in the future. So what the harm reduction approach argues is that rather than, let's think about people who do drugs, not necessarily as criminals, but people who might need medical attention. So instead of putting them in jail where they're very unlikely to get the medical attention that will help them, instead give them the treatment, the best treatment that works. So let's think about heroin, cocaine, and other kinds of drugs as we think about tobacco and alcohol. So that's pretty much what these guys are calling for.
Kind of interested in this, in the demand side of this. I mean, we've talked almost all about the supply and how it's getting in. Well, and I've heard politicians in Mexico say, well, if there wasn't such a high demand for illicit drugs, there wouldn't be the drug cartel. So, what do you think? What is a rational program to reduce demand? What would that?
Well, what some of the more successful countries have done is to teach their kids at school. Find when is the right time to start doing this, and make them realize that these are things that are out there that they might try to use at some point, and there is all kinds of terrible things that can happen to them. Rather than keeping them out of the conversation, so education is one of them. Another one is, if you're gonna do it, don't do it alone. Seek help. Go to professionals that can actually monitor how you're doing this and steer you in the right direction so that you don't become too dependent on it. So those are two of the key. This is what we call harm reduction. The idea is that, like alcohol, it's always going to be there. So you have to rely on the individual to assess what's right, what's not. And at some point, some of us are probably not going to get it right, and we need help. And then we need to make sure that the help is provided there by the right medical institutions, by social workers, by schools as well.
So that's all decriminalization, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just heard today, as a matter of fact, on CNN, they discussed the deaths due to fentanyl in the United States and Canada. From 2019 to 2020, they didn't give real detailed information, but it went up 30% in the United States, deaths due to fentanyl, and 67% in Canada. The other thing of note, which is what I was going to ask you, we talked about Latin America, but this news report stated that the fentanyl was being basically brought in from China. And then to Mexico, where it must be processed or whatever they do, and then brought into this country. When you're dealing with a country like China, I guess my question is, how can you even begin to approach some sort of partnership or whatever you want to call it to reduce, from fentanyl just seemed, as you were talking about in the beginning, how you can go from, one drug becomes popular and then it switches to another one and then it switches to another one. But to my knowledge right now, fentanyl is like the deadly one, like the deadly one. But I guess my question is more a political one. Is there any way that we can deal with a country like China to prevent, that answer, no?
Yeah, well, when we have a case of international trade, so one of the principles of international law is the respect for state sovereignty. States can do whatever they want, which is nothing to do, unless they agree to set some limits on the sovereignty. They normally do to achieve goals they couldn't do alone. They normally put those limits on paper through treaties. So there is what we call a legal framework, a drug regime, an international drug regime that basically spells this out. So what the US can do is to basically bring China to the table and make sure that they're aware of the letters of the of agreement, the articles of agreement of the treaty, and ask them to enforce it. And the US has, in international law, has enforcement mechanisms. Countries can actually retaliate. If the US has evidence that China is facilitating the production and transportation of illegal substances into the US, so the treaties normally have clauses that allow countries that believe that the treaty is being violated to actually retaliate to force the others into compliance. And normally what this happens is countries, for example, are allowed to set trade barriers to penalize other kinds of exports from another country. So that would be one of the avenues to pursue. The difference between China, so this is the question about China, so is China just another country? Well, it is, but China is a big one. And unlike Latin America has basically signed thousands of treaties by which they agree to collaborate with the US. But normally what makes the news is not the thousands of treaties where they're on the same page. It's those issues, the few, the two or three, that become political and sensitive. So the US and Latin America consult with one another on a regular basis. They coordinate policy. They normally are there for each other. China does not. China does not have a lot of agreements with many countries. I mean, the US has a security agreement, for example, with about half of the countries of the world, by which they basically claim your security, Ukraine is my security. So I'll be there. I'm sorry, I just hit my microphone for those listening at home. That was not a Russian bomb, honey. Okay. So it was me pounding on my heart. But China only has one agreement with one country, North Korea. So China only pledges to work closely with North Korea and be there should North Korea need China's help. But for the rest of the countries, China likes to work through bilateral relationships because China knows it's a big one. If they negotiate with countries individually, they're likely to be bigger than the other countries. So they believe that gives them more bargaining power. The US prefers to work through multilateral organizations because it's more efficient. If you basically reach an agreement with 65 countries, then you don't have to negotiate 65 treaties. Just bring them to a nice city, feed them some nice food, and then tell them let's agree on the goals, then discuss the policies, and then go home and enforce them.
With regard to your political economic background, how much do you think your criminalization has to do with money, raising tax money by the government versus actually helping?
That's one of the arguments that was put on the table in Portugal and the Netherlands when this argument was developed. So what are the reasons why we should do this? One of the arguments from conservative financial hawks is, why don't we take the money, if we legalize it, we can tax drugs. With the money, the tax money we get from drugs, we can fix roads, or we can build medical facilities where we can treat these people. So societies negotiate this very, very differently. One of the arguments, so I'm from Beloit, so I'm within walking distance of Illinois. So when I was listening to the arguments for legalization in marijuana in Illinois, the big argument here was, tax money. So if people want to do drugs, tax them, makes it more expensive for them, and then use the tax money to lower the taxes of other people. I think, for better or worse, apparently their expectations of how much money was going to come in through the marijuana tax were greatly exceeded. Because I think one of the, I read some studies that some people took to marijuana to deal with the mental cost of the pandemic. So can't remember how much money came in from marijuana sales tax in Illinois last year, but I seem to remember it was in the hundreds of millions.
I didn't, the tax coming in was more than they anticipated?
More than anticipated,
Oh.
way more than anticipated. Yeah, I think they were anticipated something in the neighborhood of 20 million. Now they're talking close to 200 million.
If I could interject a few things from people online. There's someone who's following along who is watching from the faraway land of Sheboygan that wanted to thank you for doing this lecture online because she couldn't make it to the library tonight, so she wanted to thank you for that. There was also, with the legalization question, Michael had essentially a two-part question. The first part is, how successful has legalization of cannabis been among states which have implemented it, which you sort of addressed, and then you went on to say, even in affluent Naperville, Illinois, billboards advertising cannabis are common. I have not heard outcry about social costs or praise about its benefits. What have you learned from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, so well, thank you. I will be waving to the wonderful land of Sheboygan in about an hour when I drive back there. So thank you. So I haven't really looked in a great deal of detail to the impact on states from an international, sort of from a political economy perspective. The idea is if there's money, there's going to be people chasing the money. So who's going to get it? So that's what we study. And those who get the money normally use it to produce more money. And those who get less money would probably have fewer resources to get more money. So from that perspective, the argument was, who do you want to get the money from the drug trade, the state through taxes or the cartels? That's one of the choices that we need to make here. So, you know, from a political economy perspective, that is, I think, a very simple question, you know, to be answered. Another argument for decriminalization or legalization. So we have to be careful what we mean by decriminalization or legalization. Legalization means we make it legal to use drugs. Decriminalization means it's not necessarily legal, but we're not going to chase you down if you use them. Just use them wisely. Don't get out of control. Because then if you really, you know, go over the top and you cause a major problem downtown, then break a window, then the police will come and get you. So those are two things we have to be careful: decriminalization versus legalization. But the main argument here really is, in essence, is the minute that you stop chasing the trade, you make it harder, it becomes easier, so the returns start to fall. So there is less money, that you can have more competition. Competition supposedly will get to better goods. It will drive the price down, and then if you tax it, so the drug will be cheaper, better, supposedly. If you tax it, you can use that tax money for other purposes. So the argument here again is, you know, if the price goes down, will people use more? That's a very legitimate question. And I don't know what's going to happen if we do that in the beautiful land of Sheboygan or in the beautiful land of Beloit. But what we see from the record from the countries that did this 20 years ago is that the number of deaths went down, the number of other health conditions related to it went down, and the drug use, particularly long-term use, also went down. So we have that as well. Now think about, you know, what's going to happen with all of the violence in Mexico or Colombia or Guatemala. That should probably go away as well.
Here we go, legalization. I'm not talking about marijuana, I'm talking about drugs in general. You were talking about all that. And countries like Portugal or the Netherlands, legalize drugs. So now people are going to be getting a clean drug from that. So the deaths went down because people aren't getting the crap that they were getting.
and they don't have to do it, and people who do drugs don't necessarily have to do it. I shouldn't say healthily. I mean, how do you do drugs healthily? But responsibly. Like it's like drink. If you're gonna drink responsibly, so I'm not gonna drink on my way down because when I wave at the land of Sheboygan, I might actually crash into it. So that is the idea. If you actually decriminalize and they take away the social stigma, people will seek help when they need it. Okay. And so there is a virtuous cycle that comes into place.
Well, my question is, they would get in there, right?
Yeah, well,
They would be going on the streets with.
If you allow it, the health department is going to be looking at what's in it. So you have to comply with health standards. You have to make sure that it's healthy to use, that it's transported properly, that it's stored properly, that the sell-by date is honored. So there's all kinds of guarantees that you don't have right now. Can be manipulated or can only be manipulated within certain bounds established by the law. So these are some of the advantages that come with that approach. But right now you can't do any of that because it is illegal. So
I'm gonna just follow up with kind of what this gentleman was saying. My daughter lives in Colorado, which has been legalized marijuana, one of the first in the United States. And let me tell you, they're doing like really good things. And what made me think of it is because there's marijuana farms. They don't need Mexico or China or any of these other places. They legally grow it there. You know, it's regulated, it's processed in Colorado, and then it goes to the, what they call dispensary. So it would really, I guess, just from this brief conversation, it seems to me that would have all kinds of positive effects, particularly when we start talking about, cartels and people, leaving their homes and all that other kind of stuff. The state always also has a sustainability program in place with the marijuana growers and the beer companies. And it has to do with soils and all this, they partnership sustainability. So it just seems, again, with limited knowledge, that the legal aspects, and I'm not talking about, hard drugs, but some of these, particularly marijuana, the statistics show that the legalization seems to work in a very positive effect.
Well, I mean, the book that I showed at the end, the one that talks about, American federalism will take care of the problem, is exactly what you illustrated. Colorado took the lead. States are watching Colorado. The political economy effect, one of the main founders for the legalization campaign in Illinois was the Colorado company. That basically were pouring lots of money into the media in Illinois, saying, there is tax money coming your way, good quality stuff coming your way, not just anything. So they put a lot of money into the industry in Illinois, and I'm sure now, based on the data, there's probably booming businesses down there. And actually, I have to say, based on anecdotal evidence, there is one of those dispensaries that actually opened on the Wisconsin border next to Beloit, where there is nothing, there's no houses or anything. I was just thinking, is that catering to the Illinois people or to my students? So.
Used to be the same.
Yeah, by the way, I'm not endorsing legalization, criminalization, or anything. I'm a social scientist. I took a very interesting argument by a very prominent social scientist who said, let's take a difficult topic and throw some data out and arguments and ask difficult questions. Basically what I'm doing is just looking at the data as truthfully as I could, and I couldn't find always the right data that I really wanted to find. So it's not a lot of data, in part because when you're dealing with illicit industries, it's very hard to compare once you legalize it, because then you collect data to what was there before. So all of these data that is based on illicit industries, has to be taken with a grain of salt. They're indicative of trends rather than than absolute truths. But in the social science, we say social science is the art of the possible.
So in places like Mexico, Colombia, there must be a kind of an incentive in their economy to keep on doing this. Right?
Political economy approach. If you have that made a living for 3 decades making cocaine,
right?
If that goes away, you have nothing.
And there may not be as many economic alternatives.
Right, correct.
You
And
know,
that
if they
was,
stop doing that, I mean, what are they gonna do?
that's
You know,
right.
you know.
And whatever you do is not gonna be as lucrative. So you don't make as much money from, producing cocaine than you do from producing tulips.
So if we legalized it and we said, okay, Mexico, which, you know, we'll buy your cocaine. Wouldn't that be a win-win for both sides? You know?
Or maybe production will move to the US, to Florida.
Oh, yeah.
So we don't know. One of the things that, one of my topics of research is environmental studies. The environmental cost of the drug industry is appalling. The destruction of the rainforest,
really?
the use of chemicals, pollution of the waters, and that's one of the problems of illicit activity. You're not really watching it, and then when you do aerial spraying, you basically put a lot of chemicals, not just on the drugs you want, but also the nearby forest, and also farmers. This is one of the problems of indiscriminate spraying. Lots of farmers, lots of crops, because the wind just blew in the wrong direction. So that didn't make that approach very popular among those who happen to be neighbors of. So it is a very difficult problem. There is, yes, and if it were easy.
What's amazing is the Americans are losing, the United States is really losing credibility and popularity, et cetera, in these countries. And yet, it hasn't done a damn thing to lessen the drug prices.
In America.
I mean, there's been no win at all.
Well, I wouldn't say, so most people, opinion polls on Americans in the US are very positive. Latin Americans look at the Americans, they like them, even in Cuba. They just don't like the American government. They believe the American government is hypocritical. They talk democracy, human rights at home, but then they support guerrilla insurgencies or counter guerrillas in Latin America.
Do they like American business?
They like them if they actually create good jobs.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So I think we have to be careful. This is one of the areas where there is very hot feelings in Latin America.
Nobody likes the American government.
Migration as well. Yeah, I think that's one of the virtues of democracy. We all share our passion for Latin mafia in our government.
Good luck.
And I think on that note, was somebody asking something as I was starting to talk? No? Okay. I think that's a good note to leave on this evening. Unless someone has a burning question to get it.
What's next week?
Next week, which I was going to tell you, is it is a colleague of Professor Toral's.
My boss.
Professor Beth Doherty will be here.
Yes.
From Beloit College. She will be discussing Biden's agenda, and as that is a very broad topic, she will address certain points, but what she's going to primarily focus on is the administration's policy in Afghanistan and what led to the withdrawal. So another excellent evening of great decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. So thank you, Professor Toral, for being here this evening. Awesome lecture.
I really wanted to attend that presentation, not just because she's my boss, but she is a really good expert on American foreign policy on the Middle East in particular. So you're in for a treat. And she's a very eloquent speaker, much better than me. Yes. She's my role model. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Have a great night.
Safe ride home.
The dog.
Oh my God.
Sign up for it.
I would never.